They called his tactic insane, and on a moonlit night it made the difference between catastrophe and survival. May 18, 1943. Northwest Germany under a thin veil of cloud, the Ruhr Valley quiet beneath the climb of an enormous bomber force. The Royal Air Force had gathered 360 Avro Lancasters for the single largest night raid thus far in the war, flying in a concentrated stream toward a handful of dams whose destruction could have turned river valleys into inland seas. Floodwaters would have drowned factories, wrecked rail hubs and roads, and reshaped the ground where armies moved. If the dams failed, the scale of disruption might have been measured in tens of thousands of lives, and a dramatic reshuffling of the front's geography. The Luftwaffe watched the bomber stream and found itself caught in a brutal arithmetic. The Lancasters, flying in dense formations, defended one another with overlapping fields of fire. Night fighter doctrine at the time favored approaches from below and behind, stealthy intercepts where a single fighter could slip in, fire, and escape. But against a well-formed stream of four-engine bombers, that geometry turned against the attacker. Any fighter that tried a low-angle shot through the stream was exposed to converging defensive turrets and to the sheer mass of the force. Attackers were detected, fired upon, and shredded in seconds. The math was merciless. A night fighter attacking from the rear or below had seconds to find a clear line, align guns, and fire before defensive gunners brought down the attacker. The defensive geometry of the Lancaster, long wings, multiple turrets, and overlapping arcs, meant surprise was fleeting. Luftwaffe losses for nocturnal sorties were mounting. Standard approaches were becoming orders to die. The problem looked, to many, insoluble. That was the problem Hauptmann Heinrich Baer set out to reevaluate. He was 28, already an experienced ace with a reputation for technical curiosity rather than blind bravado. Watching film and studying geometry, he asked a brutal, simple question. What happens if you attack the bomber from above instead of trying to slip under it? If a fighter could position itself precisely over the stream and then fall vertically through the bombers, aligning the entire aircraft as a single striking weapon, the shot physics might overcome the defensive advantage. The proposed method was radical. It required a roll to inverted flight above the bomber stream, then a controlled near-vertical descent, what Baer called a controlled fall. The idea was not an uncontrolled kamikaze plunge, but a disciplined, aerodynamic dive. Line up the aircraft's axis so the guns, wings, and sights all pointed through the formation. Let gravity add to speed and stability, and fire in a single, concentrated burst while passing down through the stream at angles enemy gunners could not effectively match. The dive would close distance so rapidly that defensive gunners could not bring all their weapons to bear in time. The fighters' forward guns, converged and delivering huge volumes of fire in a short window, could inflict fatal damage before return fire found its mark. Technically, the logic leaned on geometry and the physics of relative motion. At altitude, the fighter has potential energy to trade for speed in a dive. At the right angle and with proper trim, roll, and elevator control, that energy stabilizes the aircraft's aim instead of tearing it apart. Convergence, the alignment of multiple guns so their bullets meet at a point down range, meant that, in a vertical pass, the effective lethal zone could be made narrow, but incredibly lethal. Rates of fire mattered. A burst of high-caliber nose-mounted cannon or synchronized guns could deliver a torrent of incendiary and armor-piercing rounds into the Lancaster's vulnerable structures in a single, decisive second. To most of his superiors, Baer's plan looked like a suicide run. The high command called it insane. The risks were explicit: structural stress on the fighter in steep dives, the physiological load on pilots pulled into violent G-loads and the risk of blacking out, the danger of colliding with wreckage or other aircraft in the stream, and the difficulty of reorienting the fighter afterward to escape or regroup. More practically, the night fighter units had never trained for such precise vertical work under combat conditions. Doctrine had hardened into standard approaches, radar-controlled vectors, and clipped attack profiles, not free fall through 1,000 tons of metal. Baer did not ask for permission so much as he argued the physics until permission became inevitable. He ran the numbers, compared dive speeds and structural limits of the Focke-Wulf FW-190, and worked out where the convergence would make a vertical pass most effective. altitudes and distances where the fighters' guns would be concentrated on a Lancaster's vital areas. He proposed an operational profile: climb above the stream, establish position at the stream's crest, execute a controlled roll to inverted, catch the nose down and let the fighter fall through the formation, open fire at the converged zone as the bomber passed through the firing envelope, and then use remaining energy to pull clear, rejoin, and reload. The maneuver was simple in principle and brutally exacting in execution. Training followed, and it was a crucible. For 6 weeks, units worked dawn dives over empty ranges, practicing inverted rolls, attacking on strict sight pictures, timing bursts for maximum effect and minimum exposure. Pilots recorded episodes of tunnel vision and transient blackouts as they learned to manage the G-forces that came with steep pullouts. Some trainees never recovered from the initial assaults on their vestibular systems. Others adapted, learning to brace, breathe, and rely on instrument cues when sight failed. Ground crews learned to adjust trim and control linkages for repeatable dives. Night navigation had to be impeccable. Position was everything. A miscalculation of altitude by a few hundred meters could turn a precision pass into a fatal collision. The cost in training attrition was never hidden, yet discipline, repetition, and a ruthless focus on the profiled envelope produced pilots who could do something no one expected. They could ride gravity like a saber through the bomber stream and come out the other side with guns still hot. The method demanded nerves, mechanized precision, and the readiness to accept that victory in such a condensed time frame would mean killing quickly or being killed. On the night of May 18th, Bear's unit was ready. 39 FW Wonder 90 fighters took to the skies. They climbed into the dark, engines a rising chorus against the moon. The strike force of RAF Lancasters, some 360 strong, carved a ribbon of shadow and light down the Ruhr. By the time the fighters reached their intercept zone, conditions, cloud banks, moonlight, and the bomber track had put Bear's plan squarely into play. At 21:28, the defending fighters were aloft and pushing for position. They reached an intercept altitude near 7,000 meters, where radar vectors and visual contact with the bomber stream meshed. The pilots rolled inverted one by one, nodded into their heels, and plunged into the darkness. For a brief, suspended second, each pilot's world narrowed to the canopy frame, the sight reticle, and the fall of the bomber's shadow beneath the nose. The descent rate increased. Airflow pushed against the fuselage. The FW-190's structure flexed under the load. Pilots described a sensation of the horizon collapsing, instruments becoming small rings of light. The fighters closed their guns to convergence and waited for the lethal window, typically between 800 and 400 meters above the target as they passed through the stream. That is where geometry and timing converged. At those ranges, the fighters' concentrated fire could rupture wing structures, ignite fuel tanks, sever tailplanes, or blow out engines. When they fired, the bursts were short and brutal. Cannons and machine guns barked in unison, projectiles slicing through bomber skin and into vulnerable internals. The night filled with orange flashes, not the slow bloom of a belly-shot bomber falling gently away, but quick eruptions as heavy rounds detonated fuel or punctured pressure systems. Tracer streams, thin and white at that altitude, marked the flight paths between attacker and victim. For RAF gunners, reaction time was measured in heartbeats. For the attackers, the pass lasted a handful of seconds and then was gone, an interval measured by the pilot's own panting breath and the tachometer needle easing back after the pullout. What happened that night was devastating. Bear's unit claimed a very high number of successes, credited with 43 Lancaster kills among the Luftwaffe tallies for the night. Overall, RAF losses reached 53 Lancasters during that operation, and 364 crew members were killed or otherwise lost that night. Only 133 of the 360 Lancasters even reached the target area. The rest were turned back, hit, or forced to abort. The fighters themselves paid a price. Of the 39 FW-190s launched by Bear's formation, 37 returned, meaning 2 were lost in the mission. Those numbers are not abstractions. They are pilots, crews, and technicians compressed into the ledger of a single dark engagement. Minute by minute, the raid unfolded into a catalog of violent moments. A Lancaster, struck at a wing route, broke into a slow, spiraling descent with a faint orange bloom that quickly consumed its silhouette. Another took a concentrated burst through the nose and went silent. Its navigation lights snuffed. Parachutes appeared sporadically, white against ink, and some crews ditched into fields or rivers when engines failed. The attackers, having used their high explosive and incendiary rounds in tight wedges, had to pull up and clear before friendly flak or unseen wreckage could claim them. The chaos fragmented the bomber stream. Formations spilled wide as pilots sought safe vectors and missed assembly points. Tactically, the immediate effect was profound. The concentrated losses and disruption forced the RAF to reevaluate the raid's logistics that night. Damage to the dams was patchy, repairable, or in some cases avoided entirely. The major objective, catastrophic flooding that would have immobilized large sectors behind the Ruhr, failed to materialize. In the weeks and months that followed, RAF planners noted an increase in bomber attrition on similar missions, and night fighter units across the Luftwaffe began to experiment more seriously with vertical attack profiles. The novelty spread. Other units adopted versions of the controlled fall. After the war, accounts and training syllabi in several air forces referenced steep diving attacks and methods for stabilizing aim under high closure rates. The raw mechanics of Baer's idea, using potential energy and convergence to compress lethal fire into a single survivable window, proved adaptable. Post-war fighter schools dissected the technique as part of high-angle gunnery practice. The basic insight that geometry and physics could create temporal shields against defensive reaction was absorbed into the professional lore. This is where the script must pause and reconcile a provocative claim. The title's suggestion that the tactic saved 50,000 soldiers from encirclement. Historical causality is rarely clean. There is no single archival memo that says, because the dams were not breached, X Army was not encircled, with a definitive count of 50,000 lives spared. What we can say is interpretive and precise about its uncertainty. By preventing or substantially reducing the flooding of river valleys and transport corridors, the failure of the dams to collapse removed one plausible axis of strategic catastrophe. Some historians argue that had the dams been destroyed and the waterways swelled, the resulting terrain would have severely hampered movements of reinforcements, retreats, and logistics in a way that might have created conditions conducive to large-scale encirclements. In popular retellings, that possible outcome has sometimes been summarized with round numbers, 50,000 soldiers, as a shorthand to convey scale. It is an estimate, an interpretation, not a verified, direct causal tally. Framed that way, the argument retains power without asserting false certainty. Baer's tactic contributed to the RAF's failure to achieve total destruction of key infrastructure that night. That failure preserved transportation and maneuver options in the region. Given the interconnectedness of mid-war fronts, those preserved lines could plausibly have prevented logistical collapse or an operational level encirclement whose order of magnitude some commentators have placed in the tens of thousands. The phrase, saved 50,000 soldiers, thus operates as a dramatic interpretation of a chain of plausible consequences, not a literal accounting of lives attributed one-to-one to a single tactical innovation. The prudent historian will call it a possible, even likely, outcome under certain counterfactual assumptions. The cautious narrator will mark it as an estimate. Beyond this counterfactual lies the moral landscape. Tactical genius can, paradoxically, be a force for preservation and destruction simultaneously. Baer's method inflicted lethal blows that evening. The immediate human cost on both sides was real and grave. The innovation did not take place in a vacuum. It unfolded within the machinery of a criminal regime and within a war that produced unspeakable suffering. A technical analysis of maneuver and gunnery cannot and should not detach from that ethical context. Celebrating the ingenuity without acknowledging the moral frame would be a disservice. To study the tactic is to study the interplay of human skill, machine capability, and the tragic purposes to which both were put. What followed for Baer personally was not a simple arc of fame. He survived the war and worked as a test pilot in the post-war years, continuing to engage with the mechanics that had once saved him and cost others. He died in 1957. The tactic oddly outlived the man and the politics of its origin. Lessons from the controlled fall filtered into manuals and memory. Post-war air forces, examining everything from gunnery convergence to pilot training against high-G environments, incorporated aspects of the technique into broader curriculum. The core idea, use physics to compress vulnerability and maximize effect in a single decisive window, proved too effective to ignore even after the context that birthed it had been rightly discredited. There's another stubborn lesson embedded in the training crucible. Human bodies are not machines. The feat demanded adaptation to blackouts, to the dizziness of inverted flight, to the narrow, tunnel-like focus that comes with extreme stress. The pilots who mastered it were not superhuman. They were soldiers who pushed physiological and psychological limits. Their success owed as much to repetition, to meticulous drilling, and to mutual trust within their squadrons as to any single insight. The method turned doctrine on its head only because men and women were willing to endure the training that made it repeatable. And yet, for all its technical brilliance, the tactic did not end the strategic contest. It changed engagements. It altered risk calculations. It bought hours and protected infrastructure in a night when the alternative might have been a very different map. Whether those hours aggregated into exactly 50,000 lives preserved is impossible to prove with the archival bedrock historians demand. But the broader point stands. Innovation at the tactical level can have ripple effects that reach into the operational and even strategic sphere. A single change in how a fighter attacks can make the difference between destruction and repair, between a flooded valley and a passable road, between a trapped army and one that can withdraw. In the long view, the controlled fall's legacy is technical and tragic in equal measure. Flight schools studied the dive and the physiology that accompanied it. Strategists recognized the potential for small unit adaptations to influence far larger outcomes. And the human toll, the cost recorded in the 364 RAF crew losses that night, the Lancasters counted and numbered, and the 2 FW-190s that did not return from that sortie, remains an indelible part of the record. The night of May 18th did not produce simple heroes or villains in the moral sense. It produced human beings doing what they had been ordered or chosen to do, to fight with the tools available, to innovate under pressure, and to accept that ingenuity often arrives wrapped in cost. The phrase, "they called his tactic insane," captures the outrage of doctrine confronted by experiment. The rejoinder, that on this particular night that supposed madness may have prevented a cascading catastrophe, captures the ambiguous power of a technical solution deployed at the right time. If this narrative leaves you thinking about the interplay between physics and fate, between the hard numbers of guns and altitudes and the soft arithmetic of human lives, then it has done its work. Military history is in part the study of those intersections, where a change in approach alters the course of events in ways both immediate and unquantifiable. If you enjoy these recovered episodes of Battlefield Innovation, hit like and subscribe. Heinrich Baer's name lives in the footnotes of air doctrine and in the oral histories of those who taught steep dives and trained to survive G-forces. The controlled fall found its way into training manuals and into the post-war discussion of how to create a fleeting, lethal window against a far larger adversary. It also led us to a sobering conclusion. Ingenuity can save lives even as it demands them. Consider the title again. Was the tactic truly insane? For those who lost their lives to it, and for those who endured the nights of silence after the alarms, the word has only one meaning. For historians trying to reconstruct cause and effect a half-century later, the verdict is more complicated. By preventing widespread flooding of key transportation routes on that night, Baer's unit contributed to the preservation of infrastructure, whose loss might have increased the likelihood of large encirclements. Some accounts argue that this chain of consequences could, under reasonable assumptions, have prevented the kind of mass encirclement that would involve tens of thousands of troops, a figure sometimes rounded in popular retellings as 50,000. That phrasing is an estimate, an interpretation of plausible outcomes rather than a documented tally. In the end, the story is less about a single number and more about the relationship between risk and reward, between doctrine and daring. It is about how a tactical twist, born of geometry and the courage to test it, reverberated upward to change the shape of a night in the course of a mission. It is about the pilots who trained until fainting became a classroom hazard, and then climbed into the dark to test theory against reality. It is about the fact that a single idea, judged insane by some, can be the pivot point between disaster and survival. If this story moved you, share it and subscribe for more forgotten turning points in history.